Karen, and thank you everybody for coming today. It's really lovely to see such a big crowd here. And thank you for our sign language interpreter. I know if I say something nice about him, he smiles. So there you go, see? But thank you for being here. It's a great delight for me to introduce David Olusegur to you today. David's one of my colleagues at the History Department at Manchester as Professor of Public History. He's also one of the UK's best known and respected historians. I'll make him blush now, ranked amongst the most influential Black Britons of our time. He's a BAFTA award-winning documentary maker, broadcaster and writer, the author of numerous books, including a new book for children, which came out during lockdown. And he recently appeared as an expert witness for the defence in the trial of the Colson Four, who were taken to court and acquitted for their role in the removal of the Colson statue. Now, that's obviously of relevance today, where David's going to talk to us for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So do put your thinking caps on and ask him a question if you would like to. So I'll stop talking now, because you've actually come to hear David, and I'll let him take it away.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? It's all working? That's wonderful. Thank you for coming. And I thought what we do is I'd talk for just about 20 minutes, and I'd try to provoke you about the issue of statues. So I'm just going to go straight into that act of provocation, and the reason for doing it that way is so we can have a conversation. Because I think this issue of statues is all about conversations, but it's about honest conversations. And most of the conversations we've had, or many people have wanted us to have, about statues and memorialization and about heroes have been infected with all sorts of dishonesty. I think one of the first dishonesties is the idea that any of this is new. Statues removed, toppled, reassessed all the time and always have been. The Romans called the damage or the destruction of statues of fallen heroes or of emperors that no one wanted in power anymore. They called it damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. But that was an act of rejecting the legacy, the memory of recent political or military figures. It wasn't what we are often told that removal of statues is today, which is the erasure of history. And it evidently didn't work in those ways, because those Roman emperors, such as Commodus from 176 to 192, whose statues were toppled and were damaged, of course are remembered today. And Roman statues that were defaced or damaged are actually some of the most powerful, eloquent objects that we have from the ancient world, because they speak about that conflict of ideas. They speak not just about heroicization, but about how reputations can change. And the removal of statues in our times is entirely normal and entirely common. One of the places where it's most often seen is in the former empires, because across the world, in former colonies, not just British colonies, there are statues huddled together in special facilities and statue parks. There's one above Delhi on the Durbar Plain. They're full of statues of unwanted viceroys and Queen Victorias that no one wants anymore. And they're all huddled together and pointing in different directions. It's like they're having a meeting to try to work out what went wrong. And in other museums and outside of museums across the world, there are other statues or bits of statues under tarpaulins or resting on wooden pallets. And the same thing can be seen across Eastern Europe. One of the countries that's been most energetic about removing statues is Ukraine. There are thousands, literally thousands, of unwanted Soviet-era statues in facilities across Ukraine, and they've been toppled at an increasing pace. Between the 1990s and 2017, there were a series of events in which Soviet-era statues were removed, particularly unwanted statues of Lenin. 2,000 Lenins have been removed in these bursts of decommunization In 2013, so many Lenins were removed that the Ukrainians called it the Leninopad, the fall of the Lenins. Yet, again, just like the removal of statues of Roman generals, that doesn't mean that we don't understand Lenin and his role in history. Lenin's not been removed from history because if statues have been removed from public display. The people who were removed from history were the opponents of Lenin and that regime, who were literally plucked out of history. Yet despite all of this, we live in an age when we are repeatedly told that to remove a statue is to erase history. And there are people who will demand that all statues, irrespective of who they commemorate or the context in which they were erected or what we've learned about the person they commemorate, must remain in situ in perpetuity. There is this universal defense of all statues and a universal condemnation of all removal of all statues. And it does rest on this preposterous idea that a statue means that a person's reputation can never be reassessed. No matter what we learn about them, no matter how much our understanding of them and their times changes, nothing can be learnt that would justify the removal of their statue. And again, when the defense for this is because this false claim that to remove a statue is to erase history. Now, as an historian, I wish that the perfect quote to explain how ridiculous this argument is, that removal of statues is the erasure of history. I wish it was a fellow historian who I could pluck a perfect quote from, but the best ever statement on this is not from a scholarly work, it's from a BBC comedy programme, because nobody has explained more perfectly how ridiculous this idea is, better than the fictional Philomena Kunk, played by Diane Morgan, who said this: "If you take down monuments to evildoers, people will forget the dark parts of history, which is why nobody today knows who Hitler was." It's just perfect. Nothing better summarizes that this is not just a false statement that the removal of statue equates to the erasure of history, but it's a knowingly false statement. The question is not that whether it's false or whether it's true, it's why educated politicians and journalists perpetuate this demonstrable falsehood. Another equally demonstrably false claim that's been made over the past 2.5, 3 years is that statues teach us our own history. Our own Prime Minister has regurgitated this falsehood repeatedly. Statues, he said in 2020, teach us about our past with all its faults. To tear them down would be to lie about our history and impoverish the education of generations to come. Statues, again, demonstrably do not tell us about our history with, quote, all its faults. They don't do that for a number of reasons. Firstly, they don't do it because they are incapable of such a function. History is fluid and moving and evolving. Statues are fixed and immobile. Statues are literally set in stone or cast in bronze. And those who fund statues and erect statues almost never do so with the aim of presenting a nuanced picture of history. Now, monuments and memorials can do that. But heroic statues of individuals, of historic figures, almost never achieve that function because that is not what they're designed to do, and that is not what the people who pay for them, and paying is critical in understanding statues, want them to do. Statues are physical manifestations of the great man school of history. They're built to celebrate and to validate elite individuals, not to highlight their faults or the contradictions, or to encourage us into historical debate. And they're not capable of presenting or representing complexity. And most of all, they are almost always silent about one group of people, which is the victims of the great men that they depict. The statue of Edward Colston, there's lots of things we can say about it, there's lots of observations we can make about it, but something which is just unquestionable is that it had nothing to say about the 84,000 men, women and children whom that Bristol slave trader was complicit in dispatching into slavery, or the 19,000 men, women and children who died in the bellies of the Royal Africa Company's ships while he was a shareholder and deputy governor of that company. And of course, some statues are erected not simply to memorialize and make us remember so-called great men. They are tools to silence certain communities, and they do that by reinforcing dominant versions of history. In the United States, many of the Confederate statues around which neo-Confederates and white supremacists have recently rallied, sometimes with deadly effect, are not only not attempts to teach history, they are mass-produced cookie-cutter memorials that date not from the 1860s. They're not artifacts of history. Many of them date from the 1960s, when there was a great flurry of statue building, in part in response to the civil rights movement. Some of those statues, therefore, are younger than some of the people who are defending them as part of their history. I think one of the great achievements of the past couple of years is that many of us have learned more about the backgrounds, the backstories of our statues, because of course statues have two histories. There's the history of the men, and they almost always are men, that they depict, and the history of the statue itself. On the thing about gender, there are more statues of Queen Victoria than all other named female figures put together in this country, and there are far more statues of nymphs and fairies than actual women. So when we say the great men school of history, when it comes to statues, we really do mean men. When monuments like the statues of Confederate generals have become totems around white supremacists around which they've rallied, it's sometimes been said that those statues have been misappropriated and have been co-opted by people with hateful ideology, and that they're being misused. The truth is that those statues are performing, in part, one of the functions for which they were erected. They were paid for by Southern lobby groups who intended their function to be the reinforcement of white supremacy and to shore up a romanticized fantasy version of the Civil War and the lost cause of the South. Those statues are not being co-opted. That was part of their function. And while we're better at recognizing the ways in which statues can be misused in other countries, we sometimes struggle to be quite as forensic when it's our own history. The statue of Edward Colston that was toppled in Bristol in the summer of 2020 presented the deputy governor of the Royal Africa Company as a philanthropist and a successful merchant. It was deliberately silent about his role in the Atlantic slave trade. At the opening, the unveiling of that statue, Colston was described as a West India trader, which is a euphemism. It's a code word. It's a way of avoiding saying overtly that he was a figure involved in slavery. If we were to fully accept the arguments of those who would universally defend all statues, that the erection of a statue of an historic figure renders them and their actions permanently beyond the reach of historical reassessment, then we'd have to conclude that statues are not only not history, they are antithetical to history, because they are objects, according to this understanding, that take historical reputations and individuals and place them forever beyond the reach of historical rigorous examination. And some do believe that statues place historical reputations beyond the reach of history. And it's not difficult to see why some of those people who favor statues being permanent shields against reassessment are the autocrats of today. In one of his long and turgid ahistorical essays, Vladimir Putin is vocal about his hostility towards the Leninopad, the removal of 2,000 Lenins in Ukraine from the 1990s to 2017. And in 2020, Donald Trump not only defended the statues of the Confederate generals that were then being protested against in America, he made it known that he thought it would be, quote, a good idea to have his face added to Mount Rushmore. I'm not sure Mount Rushmore is big enough for his face. Those who argue that all statues, irrespective of who they depict, irrespective of the history out of which they emerged, should remain in place, were suspiciously silent in April 2003 when the statue of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad was pulled down by Iraqi civilians and units of the US Marines. And they targeted, those US Marines, that monument of the soon-to-be proposed leader, just as invading armies have always targeted statues. The defenders of statues who say all statues must remain in place irrespective of who they depict, irrespective of the crimes of who they depict, were also suspiciously silent when the temporary statue of Jimmy Savile was rightly removed after the full horrific scale of his crimes became better understood after his death. Indeed, in recent times, there's been little concern in Britain about the removal of statues in other countries. We haven't fretted about that. We haven't worried about the statues removed by British armies during the course of the British Empire. Not only does toppling statues not represent the erasure of history, at times history is erased when statues are erected, not when they are toppled. In 1774, Robert Clive, also known as Clive of India, cut his own throat, committed suicide. Samuel Johnson speculated he committed suicide out of guilt, though it may well have been because of mental illness. He had a previous history of suicidal attempts. 20 years earlier, he'd led the British Army, the British East India Company, to victory in Bengal, and then he had looted what was then India's richest provinces, diverting its wealth into his pockets and those of his followers. Their greed and their mismanagement, many modern historians believe, contributed to the outbreak of the Bengal famine, 1769 to 1773, in which millions of people died. For over a century, there's been a statue of Robert Clive outside the Foreign Office, right at the centre of British power, just behind Downing Street. Now, that monument suggests, it heavily implies, that Robert Clive must have been near universally admired in his own lifetime, and therefore we should respect and admire him in our time today. But that statue is not just silent about Robert Clive's looting in Bengal, it's also silent about another critical reality, which is that many people in his own lifetime, viewing Robert Clive through the standards of their time, regarded Robert Clive as a disgrace, as a hateful figure. He was one of the most hated men in Britain. He was denounced by the satirists as Lord Vulture, as the Madras tyrant. This idea that all statues were revered at the time, at the moment when they were erected, and it is us today interpreting these historical figures with our 21st century views, is again demonstrably false. The statue of Robert Clive that stands out today outside the Foreign Office was not erected in his own lifetime. It was erected in 1912. And it was erected by the ex-Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, at a moment when the early history of East India Company rule in India was being represented and reimagined in much more heroic terms. It says much more about the ambitions of Britain to cling on to India in the early 20th century than it says about the reality of Robert Clive and his reputation in the 1770s when he cut his throat. History can be erased not when a statue is toppled, but when it is erected. And statues not only distort history, they don't only erase the stories of the victims, sometimes they tell direct lies. One of the most frequently repeated untruths carved into the pedestals and plinths of statues all over the world is that they were paid for by public subscription. Very often, this is nonsense. And that idea of public subscription implies widespread support by ordinary people who supposedly put their hands in their pockets for pennies and shillings in order to make it possible for statues of their betters to be erected. This claim, this suggestion of democracy in statue construction is very often either entirely or partially untrue. Again, let's take the example of Edward Colston. That statue was not, as was claimed on the pedestal and on the 4 plaques around it, erected by, quote, the citizens of Bristol. It was not paid for by public subscription. The truth is the statue was paid for by members of the city's wealthy mercantile elite, the originators of and the keepers of the cult of Colston, the people from the same social class, the same mercantile group that he came from. Not only did they pay for it, they did so reluctantly. Attempts at public subscription failed. Much of the money came from the Colston societies that had evolved in Bristol, though it's been speculated that even they would not pay the final sum, and that the final amount was paid for by a man called James Arrowsmith, who had suggested and proposed the statue in the first place, and he secretly used his own wealth to erect that statue. The statue of Oliver Cromwell outside Parliament, again, was not paid for by public subscription. It's not outside Parliament because the people represented within that building were desperate for a statue of Oliver Cromwell. It was paid for by Lord Rosebery, the Prime Minister, and it was erected despite huge opposition, understandably, from Irish members of Parliament, given the nature of Cromwell's crimes in Ireland, which many Irish historians would understandably define as genocide. Another problem with statues is that they simply and evidently don't work. They don't achieve the function for those who defend them claim that they do, because we don't remember people just because a statue has been erected. They don't function. When we erect a statue so that we'll never forget someone, it demonstrably doesn't work. The best example I know of this is to think about one of the most significant, one of the most important memorial landscapes in Britain, Trafalgar Square. There are 7 statues in Trafalgar Square. All of us can name one of them. Difficult to miss. Nelson on his pillar. How many of us can name any of the other 6? If statues functioned, if statues just in a pragmatic sense actually worked, we would be able to reel off the list of admirals and generals and kings who are also memorialized in that central space in the heart of our capital. They don't work. Arguably, the most famous statue after Nelson in Trafalgar Square is the empty 4th plinth, because it works for who we actually are. It's a shifting platform for modern art. And finally, there is one argument that even the most rabid defenders of statues almost never attempt. They almost never attempt to suggest statues should be protected, should be defended, because they're good works of art. And that's because they're not. They are, for the most part, this is a technical phrase, naff. The statue of Edward Colston was a third-rate attempt by a second-rate Victorian public artist, John Cassidy. Even people who I enormously admire, their statues are terrible. I used to work in the BBC in Portland Place, and outside that building was erected a statue of one of my heroes, George Orwell. George Orwell was infamously lanky and awkward. People who met him, their diaries are full of accounts of meeting Orwell. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who, on meeting Orwell, described him in his diary as an odd fish. I don't care what Orwell's looked like. I don't care about his awkward proportions, his height, his ungainly pose, his cigarette between his fingers. I care about that mind. And yet the statue captures the physicality of somebody rather than their creativity. Statues don't work as art, they don't work as history, they don't work as objects that let us teach us our history, and removing them is not erasing of history. And yet, to have this discussion about statues, their function, their value, their importance, how we deal with them, we have to first wade through this sea of demonstrably false ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was so interesting. I'm going to use my chair's prerogative and as a historian to suggest people don't care about these statues. I think that write about them. This would be my argument as well, which probably chimes with yours. What they care about in taking down statues is uncomfortable reminders, a version of British history in this case, that they don't wish people to talk about.
I think sometimes what you get is it's very often, the history of Channel 4 is really interesting because it's a history of programs that were controversial, that became political issues. And it's every time there's a Channel 4 series that politicians want to complain about, there was a moment on the news where someone has to admit that they haven't watched the program that they're offended by. And it's something similar with statues. We only seem to care about them when someone suggests we should move them. I think it was in 2004, Ken Livingstone suggested that 2 of the statues that we can't name in Trafalgar Square, to Lord Napier and Lord Havelock, be not toppled, not destroyed, just moved somewhere else to make more space, I don't know, for more pigeons or whatever in Trafalgar Square. And people were literally, having to go online to see who they were, to then be able to justify their outrage at the removal of these 2 generals that they'd never heard of. I think people love this sense of outrage, and I think partly it's understandable, because the reason armies target statues is the toppling of a statue is just one of the greatest photo opportunities in all of history. When we talk about the removal of a dictator, we use the word topple. We almost make them into a statue. When we talk about, our dreams about what might happen with Vladimir Putin, we talk, will he be toppled from power? We make them into metaphorical statues because that idea of the toppling statue as the end of a regime is so ingrained, it's so symbolically powerful that I think there's an emotionality that's so connected with it that we worry that what's being toppled is part of our identity. But that's the con trick. Because these people don't represent who we are, because we didn't decide to put them there. It was a really kind of simple question. How many people here have been involved in the erection of a statue or consulted about the erection of a statue? If I asked the same question in Manchester, a couple of people, yeah.
Yeah.
Statue I approve of. There we go. But almost nobody is, because they are unlike today. They were put there by members of an elite. They're not democratic. They reflect members of an elite, and they're paid for and organized not by public subscription, but by members of that elite. And yet we have been convinced in many cases, particularly in Bristol where I now live, that these people represent us. Edward Colston was the elite. He was born into a wealthy family. He made that family even wealthier. He was a very generous philanthropist, absolutely. But the idea that his story represents ordinary Bristolians, that's the myth that's been created. They're not us. That's another thing about statues.
Right, thank you so much. I'd like to open the floor for questions. Do raise your hand if you're able to. Yes, gentleman here.
Yes, I'm a member of the International Brigade Memorial, and we do set up memorials around the country, and in Spain as well. But we never, as far as I know, have had a person. It's always been symbolic sort of thing with a context, so that when people go to these statues, the last one we did was in Wigan. There's a plate there that tells you about the men and women from Wigan who went. And I think so that not people. We're trying to get ideas over and to remember the brave men and women from this country who went to Spain. And I think, those kind of memorials are very valuable. Also, just one more thing. I was listening to a program on Radio 4 a couple of days ago about iconoclasm, mostly about the American statues. And he was saying that one of the points he made, which I found interesting, was that this thing about putting them in museums, which I think the Colson statue is. And he was saying that this is putting a burden on museums that they're not equipped to cover, and they don't really want them anyway. I wonder what your thoughts are on, whether they should be removed to museums or just put in a park, as you said in India,
I'll take the second question first. I think it depends on individual statues. Now, I know the curators at the M. Shed Museum in Bristol who were really pleased and excited to play a role in the city's discussion around slavery and the slave trade caused by the toppling of Colston's statue. So they were enthusiastic about that statue. We have museums full of statues we've stolen from other countries that museums very often seem very happy about. If museums didn't want statues, there's quite a lot of statues in the British Museum that I think could very easily be found another home back in the countries that they were taken from. I think there's a mixed view within the world of curatorship, but it is also a way of museums being part of this very electric, very powerful debate. But I think it depends on some statues. This idea that they are sacred objects needs to be challenged. One of the most common reasons why statues are removed is because no one remembers who they were. No one cares. It's very interesting that we look at landscape paintings, urban landscape paintings. Often people don't even know what happened to some of the statues that are in those paintings. They're in someone's backyard, or they were melted down. This idea that these are sacred objects that can never be, discarded, again, it's not historically sustainable. All statues, I think, need to be understood. Their future, their past needs to be understood as individual stories. No sort of blanket view of them. On the issue So what was the first question? It was iconoclasm. Oh, memorials. Well, I think that shows the difference between memorials and statues. I'm very keen for a very grown-up debate about statues, for them to be demystified, for us to understand them as objects rather than as these totems invested with this power. But I have a very different view of memorials. I've actually ran a heritage plaque scheme, put up heritage plaques on 3 continents. I've sat on English Heritage's blue plaque scheme. I think memorials have a very, very different place, which is why I would defend, with my last breath, a cenotaph. But I'm not a fan of statues of colonial generals or of empire builders, because I think they're very, very different things. Memorials are ways that we remember history. I think statues are a way in which we control history by making them about individuals. And that reduction of complicated events into individuals. If the cenotaph was a statue of Lord Haig, the supreme commander of the British forces on the Western Front, rather than this remarkable Lutyens edifice that allows us to remember the victims of that war, I think we'd have a completely different relationship with it. To take another example, I was brought up in the Northeast. The Angel of the North is one of the most loved monuments in this country. If that were a statue of one of the great industrialists, like Lord Armstrong, who played a very significant role in the development of Tyneside as an arms manufacturer, I don't think it's possible that Newcastle-on-Tyne will have a similar relationship with such a monument that they have to the Angel of the North. The Angel of the North is a monument, not a statue. It speaks to, even though it's figurative, it speaks to the long history of industry and dynamism of that region, now faded, now lamented, in a way that no named statue to an individual could do. So this rather ancient idea of heroicizing great men, we mustn't confuse that with the much more interesting and complex history of memorialization. Now, of course, again, because we're living in a world of false narratives and fake news and distortions and culture wars, there's an absolute determination to do that. So during the statue debates in 2020, if you went online, there were constantly people saying, well, should we pull down the pyramids? What a stupid thing to say. It's not a statue to the pharaohs buried in those, interned in those edifices. People would say, well, should we pull down buildings built by or paid for by slavery? What a silly thing to say. Those buildings have multiple functions. A statue has one function, which is memorialization and validization. So this determination to try to conflate statues with memorials is part of this disinformation war that I think has been waged about statues.
Just a final point there. One of our memorials in Nottingham, there was a councillor, Tory councillor, who, right from its inception, had been against it. The first thing she did when the Tories got a majority 2 years back, it is now back, was to remove it. That was her very first thing she did. Her name was Councillor Cutts. And she was, also a very, hard on Cutts as well. And also, there was no outcry from the Tory press about that.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions or anything they'd like to ask David? Can I start with the lady here? I think, sorry, I've got very bad eyesight, and with the pink scarf. Yes. Just here. Pink scarf, yes. Sorry, I'm sure that's not your name. It's very nice, though. Yeah.
I was very interested that you said that some of the museums were interested in having statues, because I was coming here thinking, I've got the answer to all of this, let's melt them all down, or use them for roads filling in. And surely there's a place for them. And then you tell me that there's places like India, but hundreds of them just sitting there. And I expect we've got some, as you say, back yards, etc. I was just thinking of your preferred way of removing them, but once we decide they don't need to be there, there's nowhere else to put them. Is melting down quite a good idea? I mean, I was thinking Ukraine as well. They need surely metals and things at the moment. But then you tell me they've got loads of statues of Lenin, so it's obviously not working.
There is a market in unwanted busts of Lenin and bits of statues, and wealthy people put them in their gardens. There's no shortage of Lenins out there if you want to pay the shipping fee. So that there is a sort of strange, not quite a black market, but a sort of ironic market in former Lenins. Again, I think the issue is that this is normal. I mean, removal of statues, wondering what to do with statues falling into disrepair, is just historically the way it's always been. When this debate first started, my friend Mary Beard pointed out something which I think is wonderful, is that the Romans, who you will have noticed were not very sentimental. I think the gladiator thing probably was a bit of a giveaway. They often would take a statue of somebody who'd fallen out of favor, a senator or a centurion, and chop the head off and put the head of the new bloke on. Because they're expensive, difficult thing. If you're trying to promote yourself and your family and your career in Rome, it's a cheap way of getting a statue. Maybe that statue's got a better body than you. Maybe it's a buff centurion. You're a portly senator, looks pretty good. But they didn't have that sentimentality. They are the Romans, they're not sentimental. But that clashes with our idea the idea that's been promoted, that these things are sacred and unalterable. There's always been a pragmatism. If we look at the history of some statues, one of the great disasters for statues in European cities was the coming of the motor car and the widening of roads. Many statues were removed because there wasn't room for them in the street plans as things evolved. It's also important to say that a lot of this is very late. This is a late Victorian. There was a flurry of statue building in the late 19th century. There was this idea, and Bristol is one of those places that really goes for this, where a city can't really claim to world status. It can't really claim to being an important city unless it has statues to its great men. And there was a sort of racking of brains to come up with who should be these people who are remembered. And one of the problems with occupying any position in history, which of course is rather unavoidable, is that you don't know how posterity is going to remember people. So very often these people who seemed massively important at the time, 100 years later, 200 years later, they don't really matter very much. I always think when you think about 19th century literature, I think would be quite astonishing to our Victorian ancestors that Wilkie Collins is hardly been remembered, and Dickens has been remembered to the extent that he has been, and that these two, giants, or Thackeray as well, that Dickens is way out ahead of the others. It wasn't predictable. It's also not predictable which of your great, city fathers anyone's going to care about in 100 years. So we have lots of statues that people just don't care about them anymore. These people just turned out in the big span of history not to be quite as important or as interesting as people thought at the time. And when you read about, as I did for Colston and for some other people, you read about the meetings that get statues erected, often it's about, there's a head of steam built up, there's some money being collected, there's a sort of process that seems to sort of, build up its own momentum. 10 years later sometimes, 20 years later, people are talking about these same statues in council meetings about what we're going to do about this, and maybe it wasn't the best idea. So they're all different. They all have different histories. But this pretense that all of these people were loved and valued and contributed enormously to their times, and that we can learn our history through them, and that our ancestors all loved them and respected them and put money towards them being erected, this kind of ocean of falsehoods is preventing us having these sort of rational, rather unromantic conversations about what we should do with these hunks of iron. And we are much more capable of doing it and having these sensible conversations when it's someone else's history. A couple of months ago, I was in the Spandau Citadel, which is on the edge of Berlin. It's an old Renaissance fortress. It's now a museum. And there they have the Siegelallee statues, which are 80 statues, around 80, that were erected in the 1890s by Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Kaiser who led us to the First World War. And these statues are of his ancestors, the kings of Brandenburg, the Prussian, many of them are highly militaristic. 1945, when the Allies captured Berlin, they decided to dynamite them. Now, these are not Nazi statues. They're nothing to do with the Third Reich. Hitler was a boy when they were erected. They're to do with the militarism that led to the First World War, but they were earmarked for destruction. They were saved by a group of German nationalists. They were buried in the grounds of the Charlottenburg Palace, and now they're in a museum, heavily curated and managed, not on pedestals, down on the ground with all of their scars and their wounds from the Russian bombardment of Berlin. Now, if a German chancellor decided to put these statues of Albert the Bear and Frederick II on display in Berlin, we'd think Germany had lost its mind. We'd think Germany hadn't learnt its history. We'd think that Germany had somehow lost the ability to understand that aspects of their history and individuals within their history could not be celebrated without context. That it would be that so there are certain figures who could not be memorialized and should not be memorialized. We would think modern liberal Germany had lost its mind. It's very easy to see this when it's statues of German warlords, Prussian kings, or Confederate generals. When it's empire builders and slave traders in Britain, when it's our own history, we get much, much more sensitive.
There was somebody over here before. Yes, just in the second. Sorry, they've given. Yeah, that's fine. I'll do you in a sec. It's somebody at the back and then you. Yeah.
Thank you. I wonder whether you see the battle between building and toppling statues as really a battle of ideas about what society we should live in now, what should be normal, and if you do see that, do you have some suggestions about why neither the topplers nor the defenders of statues seem to say very little about that?
I could probably speak about the Colston Trial because I've met the 4 young people who toppled that statue, and the reasons that they toppled that statue was, as they've said, because they think it's wrong to celebrate a man who's complicit in mass murder. And they recognize that the statue is memorialization and validation, not historicization. So they're very clear that they've been brought up in a society, they've had an education that's led them to believe that it is morally wrong to celebrate a man like Edward Colston. And I think they've been very vocal about their views that this is a moral stance. I mean, they were acquitted on the arguments, a very complicated legal argument that I can't, even though I was part of the trial, can't claim to understand. I was directed by very clever lawyers to do my history bit. They did the legal strategizing. But a part of their argument was that statue was an affront. To celebrate that man who did those things was in itself a form of crime. So I think they've been very vocal about the idea that the removal of statues is reflecting a new phase of knowledge, that we understand better who these people were, and because of that knowledge of who they were, we question what previous generations maybe did not question, which is whether it was right to memorialize. People like Colston have been disguised as philanthropists. People like Cecil Rhodes have been called empire builders rather than people who were complicit in murderous wars. A man who, incidentally, rather like Clive of India, was hated by many people in his own time. So I think people who are campaigning against this distortion of what statues are and what they're capable of, I think are very often quite vocal and quite historically eloquent about why we need to reassess statues, why we need to see them for what they really are, which is memorial forms of validation rather than forms of delivery system for history. So I think it's partly that we understand our history better, a growing understanding of empire and slavery, and partly because I think many people are seeing through the myth that statues are a delivery system for history.
Thank you. Gentleman, second row at the end. Yeah, and then the lady at the back.
I just want to ask, while you actually argue then for the case for no statues, because that was the inferences you went on, but you then mentioned that you approved of Pankhurst's statue. So if you're not arguing for the case no statues, what would be your criteria for any new statues in the future?
Well, I think overall, I think statues are naff, and I don't think they work. But I can also see the argument that if you have a memorial landscape that's dominated by white men, that one of the arguments is to add to that memorial landscape with women and people of colour, and I respect that. I'm not a fan of any statues of named individuals, because I think making people out of metal is a bit weird. I don't think they work as works of art, and it's really interesting. Statuary can be art. I mean, anybody who stood in front of Michelangelo's David can see that you can make the human form out of frail and lifeless things, and it can be astonishing. And this is not an attack on statuary; it's an attack on heroic statuary as a form of memorialization. But that's not what we have on our streets. That's not what we walk past when we're getting the bus home. What we tend to walk past are totems of power that were put there, often not very well done, often done on the cheap, that almost nobody bothers defending as art. So it's very interesting how these debates about, I mean, there's lots of art which is deeply problematic. The debate about what we should do about art that is very different to the debate about statues, because we instantly recognize and don't need to be told that they have a value in and of themselves. To talk about, I was just mentioning the Spandau Citadel. They also have the statues of Arno Breker, who was Hitler's great sculptor. And the statues he produced for the 1933 Berlin Olympics are, I'm afraid, just objectively beautiful, but they are toxic. Now, I don't want them on display. And again, I think we'd think Germany had lost its mind and lost grasp of its history if the statues of Arno Breker were to be put on display in Berlin. But they're works of art. And works of art can be troubling. They can be appalling. And they can force us to have these conversations. It's clear that Wagner's music is astonishingly beautiful, and Wagner's ideas are astonishingly ugly. I think art sometimes should be difficult and should confront us about this complexity and this duality. And there's nothing wrong with that. But most statues don't do that because they're not art. So that distinction between statuary as art and statuary as forms of validation and memorialization, I think you see it, you know it when you see it.
Thank you. So back there, about halfway down. Yes, thank you.
Hello, David. What I want to ask you is, what is today's procedure if anybody wants to topple a statue nowadays? Do we gather together? Do we have a meeting at the town hall, or what was your advice?
Well, I think the lesson from history is to spend 4 decades being ignored and then get a rope. I think that's the story, and again, that's what was missed out in the story of Bristol. I mean, that the instant reaction of the tabloid press was, this is not the way we do things. But I remember the morning after, I spoke to one of my neighbours who remembered being a student in the 80s campaigning for the removal of Edward Colston. And we've just lived through two and a half remarkable years. You can see that really clearly in the story of Bristol. At the end of 2019, the campaigners who wanted to remove the statue of Colston could not even persuade the defenders of Colston, namely the merchant venturers, Society of Merchant Venturers, a very shadowy guild with a very disturbing history in Bristol and far too much power. We couldn't even persuade them to allow us to put a plaque on the pedestal, even acknowledging the existence of the thousands of men, women and children who died or who were enslaved by the Royal African Company during his tenure and during his share ownership of that organization. We weren't even allowed to express the existence of those victims. So there are procedures. You can campaign, you can write to Historic England, you can write to your local council. But I think we're in the middle, or we're in the early stages of a much bigger debate. And the first step is to recognize what statues are and what they are not. The other thing is to recognize is that that we live in a time when politicians have worked out, politicians who don't care about these statues, who care about the electoral coalitions and triangulations that might be achieved by mobilizing our confusion about statues and our emotional connection to statues. The fact that museums are being threatened with funding withdrawal if they remove statues to men involved in the slave trade. This is not being done because people care about these figures. It's being done because people feel, the focus groups say that there are votes in this. So I guess what I'm trying to appeal for is that we actually have a conversation about what statues are and what they're not, that we think about the fact that they are often not what we're told they are, and we try to remember, we do that in the midst, I should say, of the politicization of this quite healthy reassessment of who we should and who we should not memorialize. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, David. As a person of colour, I'm really proud that people like you and Afua are in the media getting our voices out. My question is, do you think the debate about statues comes in within the wider debate of othering black people in this country? For example, we have the fact that black women are 4 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women. Black men are more likely to be sectioned. Black men are more likely to be charged for a crime compared to a white man. Black women within the workplace are the lowest earners in society. So do you think by narrowing it down just to statues, perhaps we're also missing the wider point about anti-blackness and anti-people of colour in the UK?
Thank you. I think there's a risk of that, and soon after the toppling of the statue of Colson, I wrote an article pleading for us not to allow the statues debate to overwhelm the debate about race and its place in our society and structural racism, and I think there is a risk of that. The reason I keep talking about statues is because I think it's also a way of talking about the way in which dishonesty and demonstrably false arguments are poured into our debates about these issues. The great risk is that the statue debate is the terrain upon which people want us to fight culture wars. It's a bit like, Napoleon fought at Waterloo, unaware that Wellington had been there to survey the battlefield. It was literally the battlefield he wanted to fight Napoleon on. There's a similar risk that we fight this debate on territory chosen by people who want to use these issues not to have conversations about our history and what it means, about the history of race and empire, but people who want to use those debates to win elections and create electoral coalitions. But that doesn't mean the debate's not one worth having. It's one with it's worth having it, but not allowing it to overshadow other debates. I think it's also one that's built up its own volition. It's young people who've had access to these histories in ways that older generations didn't have, who are leading these debates and discussions. It's younger people who feel this revulsion against the idea that they live in cities where these peoples are being, where these men are being celebrated. We often use pejoratives about the online existence of young people to sort of dismiss them and try to make them out as an unserious generation. We call them the Instagram generation or the Facecam generation, Facebook generation. They're also the Wikipedia generation. And you talk to any teacher and they will talk about children going home, going online, coming back and going, "Sir, miss, what about this? Why didn't you tell us about this bit? What about that bit? You were wrong about this." It's notable that it is younger people who have access to this information about who these men in bronze and marble are, who are leading these debates. And I don't think that they are, I don't think they're doing that at the expense of this bigger debates about race, because they're also the generation who, even in towns where there's tiny non-white populations, the children got together and took the knee and stood in the silence for those 9 minutes, and who've been using their social media to mobilize themselves. I think people are capable of doing both, but we should be absolutely aware that this is a territory in which people who would rather we debated marble and bronze than the lives of black people would very often like us to be.
Yes, person there at the back standing up, and then the person here. Yeah.
Hi, David. I'm going to ask a question. It might be a bit slightly off topic, but so the Queen's Jubilee has just passed. I've been going around asking people. I'm a journalist, by the way, so I've been going around asking people what they think about the Commonwealth, the culture, and all that, and how it links to British heritage and its depiction of British heritage. Spoken to people who agree with it and who don't agree with it. I always wanted to know your opinion on the Commonwealth. Do you think it's a symbol of unity, or is it a false sense of unity that has a history of, force and?
Thank you. I think it's all of those things. I mean, the Commonwealth, one thing I have to say about it is it's incredibly adaptable. The idea that nations could be in the Commonwealth and be republics was anathema 70 years ago, and now it's comfortably a family of 54 nations with many republics involved. The idea that you could be in the Commonwealth and not have the Queen as a head of state, well, we've just seen Barbados make exactly that decision. It works for many people. It's a grouping. I mean, I'm always nervous about sort of seeing it from a purely British point of view. There have been many African and Caribbean nations who've managed to leverage their membership of the Commonwealth to win political battles and win concessions, to get publicity for political issues. So there are people out there making something of the Commonwealth and their country's place in it. So the obituary of the Commonwealth has been written many times before, and I'm sort of nervous of writing another one because people have been proved wrong by its adaptability. The thing which I think is the strength of the Commonwealth, and I'd like to see that strength focused on, is it's a recognition that we have a shared history. And I think in a time when the nature of that shared history is being better understood, particularly by younger people, that the fact that we are brought together, these nations who have this shared past, in an organization, I think is potentially really useful. Because when we debate empire, we very often in this country say, well, we should decide whether or not it was a force for good in the world or a force for bad. Should we feel pride? Should we feel shame? Well, it's not up to us. Because that's not a dialogue about imperial history, that's a monologue. We can only understand this history if we recognize it's a dialogue with the other nations around the world, including the 54 nations of the Commonwealth, with whom this is a shared history. So something that brings people together, and there will be a lot of people together in Birmingham later this year, who have this shared history. I can't see it as something which is wholly bad, even though the history of empire is, of course, a lot of it is very bad. So whenever I speak to people who are pro the Commonwealth, I'm often shaped by how pragmatic their view of this grouping is and how useful it can be and has been.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I was going to go to one more question, but I think we need to wind it up now, just because David has to get a transport connection. So apologies to the person there. But can I just say thank you so much, David. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much for our questions, especially the difficult ones, because those are the ones that we, as citizens and as historians, should be thinking about. So thanks again to David.